On corvids in general and some cool special facts.
Okay.
I wish I got claps every time I taught a class when I came in. It's awesome. No, it's great to be here and fun to see some faces I know and some new faces as well. Tonight, I'm going to do a general introduction on corvids and a little bit about their evolution and taxonomically where they fit into the world of birds, their distribution around the world, and then we'll talk a little bit about kind of anatomically what makes a corvid, and then we'll take a look at some of the local species that we have here. Feel free to ask me questions as we go. Like the setup here is, with the dim lights and such, it's a little challenging maybe for a classroom feel, but I'm pretty unflappable as a presenter. So if you've got a question, feel free to hit me with it as we're going, so that way we can catch it then. We'll also do questions at the end of the evening as well, so if it's a bigger question or you think of it later, that's fine. We can go back to stuff at the end, but feel free to chime in. And then the other thing I'll say, and this is one of the things I love about doing adult education, is that I'm always learning as well. The amount of knowledge about corvids in this room is much heavier on that side of the room than it is here when you think about it, at least cumulatively, I'm sure. So if I misstate something, please feel free to, or if you have different knowledge about that, would love to hear about it. At the end or during the as a conversation piece as we're going. That's great, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation here as best we can, given the kind of format of the evening. But yeah. So then the other thing I want to share is just a little bit about my approach to corvids. So as I was putting together this slideshow, and I'm a photographer and biologist, and most of my work as a biologist focuses on mammals, and I'm involved with a lot of conservation projects that are all mostly revolving around mammals as well. And so as I was working on this project, I realized my relationship with corvids, actually my most direct relationship with corvids comes from my work with mammals. And specifically, one of the species that has a really strong relationship with corvids is wolves. And this is a wolf from the Salmo Pack in Washington State. As many of you know, I wrote a book about wolves in the Northwest. And I put up this slide just to give you a sense of kind of my world view on corvids, which is that ravens and wolves are really intimately connected. And this has been recognized by indigenous peoples around the northern hemisphere, where both ravens and wolves have lived together for a long, long time. And it's been studied by Western science as well in a variety of capacities. And some of the folklore and stories about the relationship between ravens and wolves is also similar in terms of the stories that people have about the connection between people and ravens. And so in the far north, there's stories about how ravens will lead hunters to game animals, so that the hunters can kill the game animals and then the ravens will clean up after them. And there's also stories about similar things happening between wolves and ravens as well. And this particular photo I spent about 2 weeks in this area trying to capture photos of this pack. This is the only shots I got, and it was crossing an old logging road. And the reason I knew it was about to pop out of the thick forest was because I heard it coming, because there's a raven following it. And I was sitting in my blind, and I heard this raven making noise, and I heard it getting closer and closer, and I knew there was a little old trail that popped out right at that spot, and the raven was basically tracking along that. So I set my camera up there, and sure enough, the wolf popped out and just walked right across the road. I saw it for like 3 or 4 seconds, but it was really the raven that I was tracking that led me to that wolf. And interestingly enough, there was a pair of ravens that were nested right next to where this wolf pack was then, and there was a number of places where, when I was doing research on this, that was the case. And so those ravens really know who's buttering their bread, so to speak. The other way that I have a relationship with ravens is I love to spend time in the outdoors. I'm an avid hiker, climber, skier. This was a photo of a raven from the Grand Canyon, and and maybe a little bit of a parable as well in terms of that relationship between corvids and the mammals that they kind of live and work with. Is it's not always a super friendly relationship, and this was amazing. I was photographing this raven with a long lens, and our camp in the Grand Canyon was off to the side, and we had a kitchen table that was, just maybe about from here to here, and this raven was watching my friend Steph working at the kitchen, and she set down a block of cheese right here, and then she went to get something over here, and this raven anticipated what she was going to do. I watched it all happen at a distance. It was amazing. So she set down this block of cheese, and as she was setting it down, the raven took flight. And then she moved over this way, and as soon as she got to the far end of the table, the raven had just timed it perfectly so that she couldn't get back to it. But she was just feet away, and this raven flew off with a pound and a half of cheese. So this is actually, we laugh about it, we think about it, but this is a lot of corvids have these really interesting relationships, not just with people, but with other animals like us, ecologically on the landscape. So we'll talk a bit about that today. And this history goes back a long time. And I was trying to dig up the reference to this, and I couldn't. But I believe that there's some archaeological evidence of gray jay bones in the mid piles of early humans in North America that show signs that they had been cooked and cut with stones. And so you can see it's a double-edged sword for these guys. Their relationship with wolves and with humans and with other carnivores, their curiosity and their creativeness and their willingness to kind of dance around the edges of other animals really provides them opportunities to get fed, but also, sometimes doesn't work out super well for them either. So this has been a long thing that's been going on for, on an evolutionary scale for corvids. So I want to start just a little bit thinking about their evolution and their taxonomy, and then just some kind of general thoughts about corvids in general. And in general, the family of Corvidae, which is quite large, and I'll talk about that, they're kind of known for being intelligent, adaptable, and that intelligence and adaptability in many species comes across as play. And so this raven was just doing loop-de-loops on this branch for no apparent reason other than it looked really fun, as best as I can tell. Their brain to body mass ratio in general in the family is about equal to what it is for great apes, that would be us, and cetaceans, whales. And it's slightly lower than in humans in particular, but they've got a big brain to their mass, and so I think that's another probably tied into their intelligence for sure. Different studies have shown that some corvids use tools, some very basic tools. There was another study that demonstrated that there was one particular species of corvids that demonstrated self-awareness. So using a mirror, it recognized itself in the mirror, which is actually kind of a higher order of thinking. And maybe many of you have seen other birds and what they do when they see their reflection. So the male robin that gets very disgruntled with that other male robin right there and does a lot of posturing and so forth. That bird is not having a self-awareness moment. But they're able to be like, good. And the earliest fossil evidence for the family Corvidae is about 17 million years ago, as I understand it. So I don't even know how to put that into context, but it's a long time ago. And I pulled a few charts off of various places. This is just right off of, this is from a journal article looking at the evolution of birds in general. And so just thinking about their trajectory from their relatives back in the day. A lot of you probably know they kind of related to dinosaurs and things like that. So that's like the really, really, really big view of where these guys come from? What just happened? We're back, and my family tree for birds has disappeared. Corvidae is a family. How many folks here remember anything about their taxonomy and like genus and family and order and class, right? Okay. Right. So Corvidae is a family, and a family is the next taxonomic level up from a genus, basically. So Corvidae represents a collection of genuses and species that are very similarly related, and they fall within the next level of taxonomic classification as an order, and they fall within the passerine order, the perching bird or songbird order, right? And so that means they're more closely related to things like sparrows than they are to things like egrets, which are totally different order. Does that make sense there? And it's kind of interesting to call a corvid a songbird. Maybe you listen to the melodious sound of jays and ravens and you don't think about them being a songbird, but indeed that's their kin in the realm of birds. So here's another kind of look at that. This was fascinating to me. This is some of the research I did just to dig this up. I knew that corvids could be found around the world. There's some species that are found around the world, ravens being one of them. You can find a raven in Siberia and Europe and in North America. There's about 23 genera in the world and over 120 species globally. So they've been quite successful. And actually this chart that was on the right here, which I pulled off the web, was from a research project looking at tool use in corvids, and it apparently, according to this person's research, has independently evolved twice in two different parts of the corvid family. So, and those brown bars reflect what part of the family that developed tool making. So that was pretty fascinating to me. I'm having another problem here with these slides. Sorry. This is not in there. Sorry, guys. Come on. 1 second. Buddy Forrest McBrien, he is currently working as a guide in the Alps, and he sent me a couple photos of one of their local corvids called a shuka. Does anybody know if I pronounced that correctly?
Yeah, that's correct.
Very good, thank you. Or a chuff. Yes. I think in France they pronounce them shuka. All right. And this one is a shuka a bec jaune. There I really slaughtered some French, but that means they're the shuka with a yellow bill. And pretty similar to our American crow, and they hang out a lot around in the high country, obviously all the way up into the alpine, and just looking at the landscape where these animals are living gives you a sense of the adaptability. That's something I just want to talk about. These guys have learned to live in all different climates and environments around the world, and here's the global distribution of Corvidae, right? So there's a little bit of South America that they haven't quite sorted out. There's apparently the ice fields in Greenland they haven't sorted out. But other than that, pretty much everywhere in the world you're going to find a corvid. Interestingly enough, let's see, is this thing showing up? I'm having all sorts of, there we go. Right here, so this red right here, we have one, as far as I understand, and I could be wrong about this, but there's one endangered species of corvid currently in the world. And we don't think about corvids being around here, animals that are, they're pretty robust in their ability to adapt to changes humans have made to the environment. But actually the Hawaiian crow is considered one of the most endangered birds in the world right now. There's just, I think it's less than 100 that are all in captivity, so there's none left in the wild. And they've declined for a variety of reasons. That's not all fully understood, but a lot of it's probably from diseases that are introduced to the island that affect them, and then also the introduction of rats and mongoose and feral cats has also affected them. Which, it's pretty interesting to think about. They're closely related to our North American crows, and they do just fine with things like that. But they've been on the island long enough that I suppose they had lost their species memory of how to deal with those terrestrial predators. But I think actually the primary issue is the diseases that are introduced. And those crows, we think about crows being fairly generalist. Our experience of them is you'll find them in town, you'll find them in the forest, they can make a living doing a variety of things. The Hawaiian crow was really intimately connected with several native plants in terms of dispersing their seeds. So they would collect the seeds, eat them, poop them out somewhere else, and that process helped distribute the seeds, and actually moving through the reproductive system of the Hawaiian crow helped those plants germinate. So now there's several species of native plants in Hawaii that are struggling because there are no Hawaiian crows left in the wild. So I think that also for me just reflects, again, kind of the broad variety that this family has in terms of specialists such as that to generalists that can make their living doing a wide variety of things. And very broadly found species such as ravens, which you can find across the northern hemisphere, and then really isolated species as well. Interestingly enough, the family appears to have evolved from kind of the area that's now we think of as Australia, New Zealand, that part of the world, and then radiated out from there. And currently, the majority of them are found in the tropical South, Central America, Southern Asia, and Eurasia. And there's fewer than 10 species in Africa and Australia, that area. So even though they started down in the Australia area, that's one of the least inhabited areas in terms of corvids in the modern world. Any questions about that or additions from knowledgeable members of the crowd on the kind of general, taxonomy evolution? Is there any other bird that has that wide of distribution? So it's not just a single bird, so we're talking about the family. So it's 120 species that makes up. And I would guess there's some shorebirds, like water birds, that probably as a family will have as wide a distribution, but it probably is going to be localized on more specific habitats. One of the interesting things about corvids is that they're not just living on coastlines, right? Like seagulls might be doing, or near water. You're going to find them in the jungle. You're going to find them on glaciers. You're going to find them in the forest. You're going to find them in the city. So they have spread out and found niches, ecological niches, in just about every type of habitat you can find on the planet, which is pretty cool. Questions, additions?
David?
Please.
It's so notable that a third of South America is not inhabited by corvids. It's a good mystery.
Yeah, and do you know more about why? The statement was that it's notable that the southern end of South America doesn't have corvids, and do you have any insight into that?
I don't, other than just looking at the map, it looks like the ones that are there might be adapted to the tropics, and somehow the ones that are adapted to more temperate climate have never made it.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. So yeah, the tropical area has been occupied, and the habitat in the south end is actually very similar ecologically to stuff we have here in North America, and so it is possible that it's just never been occupied by species that are adapted to those temperate regions, but I don't know for sure if that's the case.
They eat them.
They eat them? The South Americans eat them? You know, this is actually an interesting, this is total segue, side note, but we often think about wildlife populations as fairly stagnant, and then maybe there's a modern conception that there was the way the world was until Europeans like kind of spread out around the world and started introducing things and cutting down forests and changing things. But the reality of it is that there's never been a stasis in terms of wildlife populations, that even if human beings hadn't started, you know, kind of having their ecological role in the world that we have now, where wildlife populations exist would be perennially shifting, just like ecosystems would be perennially shifting. So, you know, it very well could be that basically that lack there is just a piece of the process that corvids were still in the process of occupying new parts of the globe, you know, when we took a snapshot of their distribution. So just kind of interesting to think about. Cool. All right. Well, another kind of key fact which I learned from my research is that one of the most distinctive features of corvids, and think about what you think of as distinctive features in corvids, and the crows and the jays and so forth, and I bet you didn't think about these feathers right here. But almost all corvids have these kind of bristly-like feathers that go out on the tip of their bill that cover their nostrils. And that is very distinctive in the family. Our pinion jays don't have that, apparently, but there are a few other things that kind of characterize corvids. In general, as a family, they tend to be medium or large in size. There are a few very small members of the family in other places in the world, but for the most part, they tend to be medium to large in size. The sexes are typically similar in color and size. And they tend to have a relatively stout bill, is another feature that you can think about for these guys. As I mentioned, they're in the passerine order, and we'll talk about some features for that as well in just a second. Yeah, so that's just some general kind of features to think about. And we think about our crows and our jays. You know, they are fairly, you know, relatively large birds with a fairly stout bill. Things to think about. We take a look at here's a few different, oh, God, I lost my slideshow again in here. Oh, I'll come back to it. So I just want to take a moment and pick apart some different parts of corvids to look at them separately. And so here's a illustration of a raven skull and a crow skull and a blue jay skull. So it's three different members of this family. Very large eyes, which is common in birds, are very visual species. And I really like looking at skulls because they'll tell you a lot about how this animal interacts with the world. And if you look at a human skull, you see we have this just ridiculously large space for a brain, right? We're a very intellectual species. And we have big eyes, but a relatively reduced nose, right? We're very visual. Our sense of smell is fairly reduced. And in birds, we often see, because they are very visual, they've got big eye sockets, and you can see the really stout bills here, and a relatively large brain case for a bird. So they defy the idea of a bird brain. And so just a few things to think of. Oh, see, it's changing over there. Sorry, guys. All right, back to business.
It didn't turn.
Yeah. There we go. All right. So what's going on in this photo? What's going on here? There's a conversation happening, right? And what's telling you that there's a conversation happening? Yeah, so part of it is there's a bill open, so you're assuming there's noise coming out. What are some other things that are going on there that are telling you? So remember, here's one of the things I want to point out about this big brain is it helps them with their social lives. They often have very complicated social lives, and they've got pretty complicated communication structures as well, which they need that, you know, intelligence for. And so, and this is something that we see a lot, and we may miss a lot of what we're actually seeing. So certainly we hear the crows and ravens and jays making noise, and we might even have learned a little bit about how to interpret a little bit of what they're saying. But another large part of what's happening here is there's some body language that's going on here. And I'm not going to try to dive into that world. I know there's presenters coming later on in this class that are going to do a lot more to that. But there's an interesting social dynamic that's happening here that I don't know all of the details of it, but it all revolves around that dead salmon in the middle there. And but there's clearly by watching corvids, you can see that there's complicated conversations happening between these birds, and they're watching the world and they're thinking about things and they're talking with each other about it, and that's happening both auditorily and visually as well. And that's, you know, one of the signs of their intelligence. Taking a look at their bills, so these stout bills are make them flexible in how they're used. Some of our species are specialists, as I mentioned, so that long sharp bill of a Clark's nutcracker works really well for accessing pine seeds, and the stout bill of a raven, which has a very different design. It's a little bit thicker, makes it more powerful, and they do a lot more scavenging on meat, trying to move, you know, carcasses apart. They also can eat seeds and such as well and use it for that. But a fairly stout bill. What I don't have here is a comparison, but for those of you that are birders, you can think of different bird bill structures. So the very fat bills of sparrows, which are just kind of specifically for seed cracking. The very slender bills of like a hummingbird that are designed for accessing you know, nectar out of plants. And so these kind of bills, you can just start imagining what that, it's a tool for them, and you can start thinking about what would that tool be good for, and they'll start helping you think about the types of things that they're going to be eating. So in general, corvids are pretty flexible in their diet. Even the specialists, even things like nutcrackers, which have this really specific kind of ecological niche that they fulfill, they'll also spread out and eat a lot of other things as well. So just a few things. Insects make up a lot of what they eat. Here's a scarp jay with some sort of insect larva in its bill that I had picked up off the ground, so it's foraging on the ground. Here's a raven with looks like a larval state, or like the insect goes into the chrysalis, right, and then it gets eaten by the raven. Yeah, so a lot of insects, scavengers for sure, and interestingly, these were fish that were killed by wolves, and they're now being consumed by. There was a bunch of crows and ravens on them. This was on the west coast of British Columbia, and so they're following around the wolves and getting fed in the same way that they follow around people. And one of the things I've definitely learned is they keep some really interesting company, and they often will overlap with each other. So who knows what that bird is? Yeah, it's a gray jay or a camp robber. This was a camera trap I had set up on a pile of deer scraps to try to, actually it was up in the subalpine here in the North Cascades. I was kind of hoping I might get a wolverine to come and into the slide here, but I got these guys, and then I got this. So there's the gray jay in the back and a Clark's nutcracker in the front. And then the next one I got, here's the Clark's nutcracker and a Stellar's jay. So, you know, there's all these different corvids coming and cleaning up on that. So, and these are all different species, but they're, you know how to make use of that. And then just to give you a sense of the company they keep, this was like really late fall. This was a very sleepy bear that rolled through and sniffed at that stuff before it disappeared. And then these guys as well. So again, just the same way that sometimes they've ended up on the diet for humans when they come in close, I'm sure that their interactions around these guys also sometimes end not as well as they would like. What's that? Scat, I hear. A pellet. Yeah, so this is a raven pellet. So I'm sure that you guys have heard of like owl pellets. Well, many birds will cough up pellets, and this is the stuff that they can't digest and whatever they're eating. And so a lot of folks don't realize that corvids will create pellets, but they do, and ravens are, fairly large in size. And you can often see what they've been eating, and this one looks like there are some seeds in there as well, and some sand. This was on the Oregon coast. And looks like some vegetable matter there as well, so fairly varied. If you find a seagull pellet, it's just all typically like, well, unless you find it outside of like a dump or something. You find it in a wild spot, it's typically all like crustacean shells and things like that, but with corvids, you'll find they can contain all sorts of different things. Sometimes they'll be filled with berries, sometimes they'll be filled with insects, sometimes they'll be filled with, hair. You can find all sorts of different stuff in there. Feathers, eggshells. So keep your eyes out for these if you see them out there. Kind of neat there. Yes?
Does that mean they can't digest any of that stuff?
Great. So the question was, that means they can't digest any of that stuff? Yes. So birds typically don't chew their food very much, and how their digestive system is a bit different than ours, and their whole setup is that they'll just swallow it, and then their stomach juices, this is kind of an abbreviated version, kind of dissolve all the stuff that they can and that they can consume, and then they regurgitate all the stuff that they can't consume. And the thing that's neat about owl pellets is that they don't have particularly strong digestive acids, so they don't dissolve bones. So that's why they'll get the meat off of it, but all the hair and bones comes out, which is why you can find all these cool, skulls and stuff in owl pellets. The hawks do the same thing, but they digest more of the bones, so they don't show up. So, but yeah, many, I don't know if it's all, but many species of birds produce cough pellets to get rid of the stuff they can't digest, rather than just sending it through like a mammal would. All right, there you have it. Cool. So just want to take a quick think about the wings of corvids. In general, they've got what's referred to as a elliptical wing shape, and they're designed basically, it's a flexible wing shape, and this is comparing it to some other wing shapes you might have out there. They can take off quickly, they can maneuver quickly. They're not necessarily the most powerful soaring birds that can just travel and travel forever and ever. They're not the quickest creatures on the planet. So they have a very adaptable, typically, wing structure. And because they are bigger birds, they tend to have a reasonably sized wingspan to accommodate that. So you can see there on these crows, you'll often see heavier birds, the feathers on the end of their wings span out like that. And that actually, I don't understand all of the aerodynamics of it, but when they flap, those spread feathers help create more loft for them. So a lot of heavier birds have that, and that's something you find in crows and ravens, but I don't believe you find that in jays. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. And I spend a lot of time tracking wildlife, so you'll get a little bit of introduction to the feet as well here. Here's just a little synopsis of the anatomy of a bird's foot, and birds and humans had a common ancestor a long time ago, but some of those structures are still in there the same. So they actually are a digitigrade animal, which means they walk on their toes, basically. And so if you think of your own foot, their ankle is up here, right? And this would basically be more like the joint where your toes connect to your foot. So, and then their toes come off of that as well. The original birds, like the precursor to birds, had 5 toes, like us humans, and then they lost 1 toe over evolutionary time, and then another one of their toes evolved to come down to the bottom of their foot, which is how you get this foot structure here, which is believed to be the kind of original bird foot structure in general. And that structure is designed really well for perching on branches in particular. And that's why they're called perching birds, because they can use that back toe to grasp onto things and perch quite well. It also works well for grabbing things as well. So raptors, they perch and then they also use their feet to grab stuff. But other birds have evolved in very different directions. So in a lot of birds that spend a lot of time on the ground, they've lost that back toe, or it's basically just become very reduced because it gets in the way when you're walking. And when you watch a crow or a raven walk, you'll see they often drag that back toe, which is an interesting kind of feature. So if you were a quail, that would get annoying over evolutionary time and basically end up losing that back toe because it gets in the way. And how do corvids, when they're on the ground, how do they move? They walk, they hop, they skip, they jump, right? They're very flexible about that as well, and some more than others. So ravens and crows more flexible probably than jays. But this is another characteristic that's kind of distinctive. Not all species of birds are as adaptable on the ground. So if you think about sparrows, they typically just hop. And you think about quail, and they pretty much always run. And so this again speaks to the behavioral flexibility of corvids. If you're looking at corvid tracks, just real briefly, one feature you'll notice, and I have no idea why this is from like what adaptation it is, but you'll see that the middle toe hugs the inside toe pretty consistently in all the species of corvids. And so if you're ever seeing bird tracks and you notice that there's the inside toes kind of hug each other a little bit, that's a classic corvid thing. This is a magpie. It's a pair of magpie tracks. And then here's the much more slender tracks of a jay, with Steller's jay. Here's a little tracking mystery for you from the beach. And there's a lot of times you'll see ravens land and walk around and wonder what they're doing. And so you follow these tracks around and you can see where this bird had walked up to, there's this line in the sand. Have you guys ever seen that where there's like some sort of burrowing insect? This was probably an antlion larvae. And at the end of that line, the raven came up and dug around and dug out the insect and ate it, probably is what happened there. So probably saw it, probably landed and looked at where the end of that line was and then went and pulled it out, which is again, kind of a higher level cognitive thing to be able to sort out that at the end of that line is probably an insect that I'm going to eat. So, cool. Moving right along here. So, just want to talk a little bit about nests and their reproduction. Many corvids are territorial. Some corvids are territorial throughout the year, which means that they and their in the case of corvids, they and their partner will have a piece of land that they protect from others. So ravens will have a territory that's their land, and they'll try to keep other ravens out of it. Other corvids will be territorial just during the breeding season, and then at other times of the year they'll overlap in how they use the landscape as well. And many species are socially monogamous, which means that they are paired, kind of like many humans are paired with a partner for life. They can be socially monogamous for life. That doesn't mean there's not, sometimes they will stray sexually, but they will stay socially connected. But there might be some outside of the pair reproduction that happens there. So, and the nests of corvids tend to be structures made out of sticks and branches, and often fairly loosely constructed compared to maybe some species. This, I believe, is a jay's nest. You can see here a raven's nest. They're built in a wide variety of places, sticks and size that reflect the size of the animal. One variation in our region, I don't have any photos of it, but has anybody seen a magpie nest? What's a magpie nest look like? Yeah, it's got a roof on it. Very good. It's a construction of sticks in the bottom, and then it's got a loose roof over the top of it. So it's still kind of a variation on the theme in terms of the stick construction. So here's another piece of communication going on here. And there is another little clue here that might tell you a little bit more about what's happening here. Anybody know that? What's the color inside the mouth of the raven that's facing us? And what does that tell you? It's a young raven. Yeah, so it's begging for food. And you'll see this quite commonly. You see that there's a fish carcass there, and the kid is begging to be fed. So I think about this like the teenager that's at home and goes, "Mom, feed me." She's like, "Can't you get the cereal out of the cupboard and put it in the bowl for yourself?" So there's a little bit of that going on here. They do invest a fair bit of time in raising their young. They are, and again, I'm not an expert on all the social nature of all the different corvids, but different species of birds will spend more or less time rearing their young, and there's I think in many species of corvids on the greater end in terms of rearing young than others. So, any questions about any of that? This might be a good time for a quick break, because I'm going to transition into talking about a little bit of the ecology and then some of the individual species. But any additions, kind of cool nuggets of knowledge there about kind of the evolution, the taxonomy, either specific corvids that we have around here, or any other questions about any of that stuff? Yes?
You said that the corvids, the earliest fossil evidence is about 17 million years. How does that relate to the earliest fossil evidence of birds in general? Where were they?
So the question was, how does the 17 million years ago that corvids evolved fit in with how birds evolved? And I will either punt that to the crowd, or I will do some research on that while we take our break and get back to you. But my honest answer is I have no idea. But I am very curious about that now. So anybody have some insight into that?
David, I think Archaeopteryx, we sort of remember Archaeopteryx from Germany as 140 million years old. So birds are old.
Archaeopteryx was that considered like the first bird or the precursor to birds?
I don't know for sure. It's probably arguable. It's pretty close to a bird.
Got it.
It's heavily feathered.
Great. So we'll do some research on that, but the working hypothesis is that they came fairly late in the evolution of birds.
Okay.
Very good. Anything else? All right.
Take 10-minute break, please.
Alrighty, cool. So yeah, I want to talk just a little bit about kind of the ecological roles and relationships of corvids here. And this is a great example. And again, for me, and this is probably speaking to my bias in terms of my relationship with corvids being around their relationship with large carnivores primarily. So this was a deer carcass that had been killed and buried by a mountain lion here in the valley, and there's a magpie taking off with a golden eagle off to the side there. So and then just you've got to be kidding me. I am. Is it back? Let's try again. Alright, that was just a chance to show you the Liberty Bell there at night. I can make a print custom for you of that if you're just going to talk to me afterwards. Alright. Okay, so, and then here's just a time I want to show you. I don't think it likes the, let's see if it'll play. Here's a time lapse I'll just quickly go through. If I can hit the, come on, right there. So this is a wolf-killed carcass from the lookout pack, and so again, just thinking about how these different creatures interact with each other, and how corvids fit into that. So if you notice, just one thing I'll just point out that, oh.
So were those wolves or coyotes?
Those were coyotes in there. The wolves showed up later. All right. Well, I'll try to come back and catch I'll try to catch that video at the end if we still want to see it. But basically, it showed bobcats, coyotes, mountain lions, wolves, ravens, and magpies all coming in on this one carcass. And again, just to reiterate this, like, how these birds are, working in, as a part of a system that includes a number of other species there, and that, and an important part of that kind of world. So this is a wolf on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and those are northwest crows behind it in the distance. You can see them walking around, and they just kind of lingered where the wolves would go, and they would just kind of generally follow and just keep an eye out to see what the wolves were doing. And there's an interesting, so this gets into wolves, which I know a lot about, but there's an interesting story about their relationship to ravens that I don't believe I mentioned before in terms of evolution and ecology, and that is there's two thoughts about why wolves are social. And one of the thoughts is because it makes them more effective at killing things, killing large animals, and there's actually fairly limited evidence to support that they become more effective at killing in larger groups. The other reason that they might be social is because it helps them consume large animals more quickly, keep it within the family. And the reason that they would do that is so that way they would have to share less of it with other animals. So that was a wolf that killed deer that in the video that we almost watched. And then there's all these other animals feeding on it. So if you're social, if it's not just you feeding on a deer, but it's you and your sister and your brother and your 5 kids, you can eat that deer more quickly and you don't have to share any of it. And so there's actually research that was done that showed just competition with ravens by itself would have enough pressure, to drive wolves to be social animals. And actually, indeed, wolves and ravens have lived together across the northern hemisphere for a long, long time. So there could have possibly, plausibly been pressure from ravens on wolves to drive them into their social behavior. So that's kind of interesting to think about. These are just trying to get back to the idea that these are long-standing relationships that these creatures have with mammals such as wolves and ourselves. And so I kind of trip out about that when I'm watching a raven watch the dumpster to see if there's anything interesting going in there, that they've been doing that with humans for like as long as humans have been in the northern hemisphere. So pretty wild. It's not just crows and ravens. So this is a video of a mountain lion and a Steller's jay. The Steller's jay just shows up at the end though, so watch for it. And this is from the Methow Valley as well. Let's see if I can get to it. Yeah. Let's do a little scent marking here. And just walking off into the woods. This is a remote camera, it's triggered by motion. You think, oh, this is just like such a stealthy creature, quiet, moving through the forest. maybe you've had this experience if you're out for a walk in the woods and it's nice and quiet. Maybe you're out hunting in the fall. I see the Stellar's jay at the top, fly in, and then take off after it. Yeah, so that jay is following that line, and it's quite common for corvids to be doing that because, again, they know where the bread is buttered. So there's just an interesting thing to think about in terms of their ecological relationships there. All right, I think these videos are what's crashing.
You want to learn about those, come March 1st. Hopefully we will not have.
All right. So it's not just with mammalian carnivores they have an interesting relationship with. This is probably a tenuous situation right here for both of these creatures. And that can, again, go both ways. And you'll often see birds mobbing each other. And corvids are on both ends of that story, as you probably have seen, right? And so they are really good at mobbing larger birds. And that might be because they want them away from their young, or they want access to the food that they've got. I'll show you that one in a second. And then, of course, why are they mobbed by smaller birds?
Predation.
Predation, and specifically, they're just tremendous nest predators. Many corvids are just really, really good nest predators. I actually had a friend who worked on a bird nesting study in Western Washington, and they were having issues because the crows figured out that she was a nest researcher. And so the crows would follow her to the nest. Yeah, so it was like, then they had to change their whole behavior around that because they were, yeah. All right, let's see if this, cool. All right, so just another kind of, I also think these guys are kind of fearless, which is pretty cool. Because I mean, I wouldn't want to poke around at an eagle. I don't know about you at close range, but if I was a lot smaller, that would even make it worse. And you'll watch how the eagle will come over and try to eat a little bit, and then they'll come peck at it, and then another bird will come in and start feeding. You know, so they're playing a little game with this eagle so that they can eat. Right, feel sorry for the eagle. You do not want to mess with corvids. Right? So, anyway, it's kind of cool. I think that's the last video I've got here, so maybe that will help with that problem. All right. And again, to put humans in that context as well, this is a Clark's Nutcracker on my truck. And that same relationship, again, we're just another piece of that puzzle. All right, so I want to wrap up the evening just going through our native, some of our native corvids, and feel free to follow along in your bird book if you've got it, as we talk about some of the identification stuff. Birding and bird identification, I think I got my corvids down pretty well, but I bet there's some really amazing birders out there in the crowd. So if you've got more kind of neat tidbits to add about our specific species here, either in terms of identification or in terms of behavior or things like that, I warmly welcome that. So I want to start with our crows and our ravens, who are in the same genus. So they're more, crows and ravens are more closely related to each other than they are to jays. So taxonomically speaking, they're more recently split from each other. And what are some of the things that we look for identifying ravens? What are some things you look for? Big bill, big animal. Anything else?
Tail.
Thick
tail.
Thick tail? Big tail. Spade tail. Spade meaning
Diamond.
wedge shape. Okay, great. That's how I've heard that before. Great. Good. So we've got our ravens and then our crows with a more slender bill. I've always heard it round raven tail and a cut crow tail. Now we'll take a look at that real quickly. And a bit smaller as well. Here's a crow taking a bath in a puddle in Seattle. And then we have a third species of crow here, the northwest crow. And as I understand it, northwest crows are smaller than the American crow. And other than that, besides their geography, in terms of visually distinguishing them, it's very hard or impossible. And I also don't know that there's much overlap in their range. But is that? Great. So there's a comment here that possibly northwest crows are, very limited to shorelines. So there might be a specific habitat preference there as well. And they are definitely northwest coast. There's most of their range is up in British Columbia, but a little bit down in the San Juans, it sounds like, as well. So, and there's a northwest crow, which I know because I was on the beach on Vancouver Island, and it was not terribly large. So, but I would have a hard time telling you why that's not an American crow. And just to take a quick look at them to compare in terms of size and structures. Yeah. How many folks here struggle with their crow and raven identification sometimes? Yeah. Sometimes. So, yeah. And any other kind of addition? Yes?
Okay, if I don't learn anything else tonight, I want to know how to identify a raven versus a crow in flight. And I know about the wedge tail, but there's a lot of the crows, when they fan it out, it looks rounded. It's not straight.
So I'll definitely open this up to the crowd on that one, but I would concur that I would say in general field marks are not necessarily, there's very few field marks that work 100% of the time in the field for identifying animals and birds in particular. And so I would concur that sometimes it might appear that it's not beautifully textbook in shape, but I'd say in general if you watch them, watch them long enough, there might be some distinction there. But are there other comments about that?
Not directly, but I've always heard that the ravens are more inclined to soar, and the crow will tend to beat away.
Great, so ravens might be more of a soaring, might do more soaring as opposed to more flapping from crows. That might be something else for us to look for as well. They are bigger with a bigger wingspan as well, so that might help them with their soaring as well. Any other thoughts on the tails or field identification of crows and ravens in flight? Things that folks use and like besides the shape of the tail? Vocalizations, yeah. So, and there are just certainly very distinctive vocalizations between ravens and crows, which I didn't bring any audio for this, and I know that there's things coming specifically on ravens and crows. So I might punt that one as well, unless there's any kind of specific comments that folks or questions folks have on that as well. Please.
I find that crows are more groupies than ravens are.
Great. So yeah, you might find more of a collection of crows as opposed to pairs in ravens. Although when you get a good food source, you might find more ravens. That research I was referring to that looked at the impacts of ravens on wolves, they'd sometimes document 60 ravens on a moose carcass at once. And that wasn't here, that was further north, so there may be some differences there geographically as well. Yeah. Good? All right. And actually speaking to Eric, what you mentioned is crows are relatively maybe more abundant or successful around here. They have more ability to overlap their breeding areas. So ravens tend to be more strict in their territorialism in terms of their partition of land and how they keep it. So that's probably why you see, potentially sometimes why you might see more crows together. They're more potentially tolerant of each other than ravens are, other ravens. Yeah. Cool.
I should get into this argument and say that since our agricultural lands in Methow have been dramatically reduced, we have far fewer crows than we used to have 30 or 40 years ago.
Oh, interesting. So there's a comment that as agricultural production has dropped in the Methow, so has the number of crows. And
the raven numbers have gone up.
the raven numbers have gone up around here.
Oh, yeah.
That's interesting, but probably not tied to agriculture.
No.
Yeah.
It's tied to the lack of crows for competition.
Say it again.
Probably tied to no crows at all for competition.
Probably tied to no crows that offer competition. Well, now we can just wax philosophical about that, but I would wonder about how well crows would be, how effective crows would be at excluding ravens. I would guess that probably the reverse would be more of the case by size, but that I'm moving on. All right. So our black-billed magpie. All right, our black-billed magpie here is seen posing with a dead deer and a coyote. And here with a clump of, I believe that's some nesting material from the spring, taken photo by my buddy Matt. So these guys are quite distinctive. You can find magpies in Europe as well, different species that look pretty similar. They're fairly large. You will see them in the valley and down in the desert in the east side of the state. You won't find them west of the crest, as far as I know, in the Seattle area or in the Puget Sound area. So a little bit more of an arid land species, and you also won't find them up in the mountains, so they're a little bit more restricted in their distribution and fairly distinctive in terms of identification. Any questions or thoughts on our black-billed magpies?
Why do they have such long tails?
Why do they have such long tails? That's an interesting question, and I don't know the answer to that. Does anybody know anything about that? I would guess it might have to do with might affect their flight and potentially make them more adaptable in terms of landing, or the fact that they tend to live in more open landscapes, potentially with things like jays, which often are in forested, brushy locations. They do a lot of walking on the ground, as opposed to jays, which would hop, things like that, as we're getting into the smaller ones, smaller corvids. Cool. And here's a photo of a Steller's jay with an elk and a grizzly bear. Kind of a similar pattern, and again, it's kind of speaking to my relationship with these guys.
David, go back. Where is the jay?
Come on. After I took this photo, I sent it out to a bunch of friends as the best bird photo I've ever taken. All right. So our Steller's jay, so we have 3 species of jays in the Northwest. We've got a Steller's jay, a scrub jay, and a pinion jay. Steller's jays tend to be more of our kind of, and here the Methow, we've got it, and then a 4th jay, we've got the gray jay as well. Excuse me. And here in the Methow, we just have the gray jay and the Steller's jay, with the Steller's jay being primarily forested landscapes, evergreen forests for the most part, and very distinctive, but kind of confused often by folks that don't know much about birds with blue jays of the East Coast as well. Really beautiful. I mean, I think it's my favorite in terms of coloration and stuff, the jays, for sure. And neither of these captured. One of my favorite features, they tend to have like the lightning strike above their eyes with the blue, which I really love. I don't have a photo of that, unfortunately. Scrub jays we tend to find in more arid environments, and often associated with oak trees, so they'll come up. They're far more common in Oregon and then down into California as well. And they have lighter undersides. They're missing the crest as well. So a very different looking bird. And I don't believe I think we have some scrub jays in kind of southwestern Washington would be my guess in the oaks, but I could be wrong about that. I know they've got them in Portland and South.
There's some in Seattle now.
There are.
And
Wow, there's some in Seattle, like in the parks and such.
My brother's house in Ballard.
Huh, in Ballard. You want to see a scrubjay, go to Ballard. Very good. Very good. Nice. Good. And then here's probably, of all the jays I know the least about. This is a photo I pulled off of Audubon's site. The pinyon jay, these guys are pretty closely tied to pinyon pine, and they sneak up into southeastern Oregon, as far as the Northwest is concerned, in the pinyon juniper forest out there. So, yeah, and they, I think, be most easy to confuse both in terms of habitat and coloration with the scrub jay. Anybody have any cool pinyon jay experiences, stories, anecdotes?
David?
Yeah.
It looks like the genus name means conifer nose.
Conifer nose.
Yeah.
Well, that would make sense because they spend a lot of time eating conifer seeds. That's awesome. We should change its name to conifer nose jay.
Conifer blue nose.
I love it. Very good. And then another kind of favorite, the gray jay or the whiskey jack or the camp robber. Who does not have a good camp robber story, right? Yeah. These guys, they're probably the most curious in terms of humans and like in terms of, well, landing on you. It's pretty hard to get other corvids to do that, but it's pretty common that gray jays will take to that as well. So. And these guys are more higher elevation, so subalpine forests. Canada jay, I think they're also called as well, so more of the boreal forest type habitat we have here in the valley, up in the mountains. And then finally, we've got our Clark's nutcracker. And these guys are just very beautiful. They're a bit smaller than a crow, bigger than a jay. They've got a beautiful long bill that I suppose these guys are conifer noses as well, maybe even more so. And they spend a significant part of the year tied to white bark pines. This is actually a ponderosa pine that this one was on. Here's our white bark pines you'll find up in the mountains. That's like a high subalpine. Our five-needled pine. They have produced really big nuts that have tremendous kind of energetic value. And Clark's nutcrackers feed on those extensively, and they collect them and they stash them. And so there's a whole ecological world that is tied up with nutcrackers and white bark pines as well that they're a part of. And there's actually some concerns about white bark pines in the West. They're really struggling for a lot of reasons. One is our warming climate is making them more susceptible to beetle infestations. And so there's been whole mountain ranges in the interior West where white bark pines have died off completely because they've been killed by that. There's also a blister rust, I believe, that I think is also tied to climate change. And then all of that's exacerbated by drought, which may also be another impact of climate change, which has made them more susceptible, also helped with beetle infestations as well, besides just the warmer winter temperatures. And besides providing important food for Clark's nutcrackers and other species, our grizzly bears in the Intermountain West spend a lot of time feeding on white bark pine nuts. They also have been shown to be important for holding the snowpack in the high elevation, where they create windrows basically to keep the snow on the ground up there, which helps with protecting against summer drought in the mountains for both animals and people. So there's a whole kind of cascading series of events going on with white bark pines, and Clark's nutcrackers are wrapped up in that as well, both for their own kind of survival in terms of if our white bark pines diminish, how that affect them, but then also they're wrapped up in the reproduction in terms of distribution of seeds and such of those guys as well. They do seem to be fairly adaptive though. They are still a corvid, so you will see them coming and feeding on other things as well. So I feel more optimistic about our nutcrackers than I do about our white bark pines, honestly. So, Any questions about any of those species or thoughts? Did I miss it? I think I caught them all. Did I miss any corvids there? Sweet. Well, then I guess I'll just wrap it up. And if there's any other questions or comments or thoughts, now would be a great time to get it out. But I hope that was a good introduction to corvids. Yes?
Do they have a sense of smell?
Do corvids have a sense of smell? It's my understanding that the only birds that have any kind of sense of smell are vultures. And I could be wrong about that. Oh, yes, please.
They do have a sense of smell.
I believe they do have a sense of smell.
Hence
You-
nostrils.
Can you say more about that?
It's actually an area of study that's not well studied at all, but they do have nostrils. They do have a brain area dedicated to smell. We just don't know much about it outside of vultures.
Got it. And it's perhaps more well developed in vultures than other birds,
Yeah,
I would guess.
absolutely.
Got it. But in general, correct me if I'm wrong on this, most birds do not rely heavily on their, it's not believed that most birds rely heavily on their sense of smell. Is that a more accurate statement?
Yes.
Good. Yeah.
What about their migration?
What about,
Do they migrate very far?
do they migrate very far? So migration and travel throughout the year is different depending on the species, and it's probably different depending on certain parts of a species population. And I believe that, well, there's certainly some corvids that don't migrate at all. So their territory, their home range stays the same summer, winter, fall, spring. And then things like Clark's nutcrackers will use different parts of the landscape at different times of year. And that may be an elevational migration more than like a distance migration. And I don't know, are there, I believe that all of our jays also stay locally. I know that pinion jays will migrate long distances. Is there any other kind of knowledge of
Yeah,
this?
well, a large portion of our crows migrate every
I
year.
don't think they go very far.
Great, yeah, so they might
They go to rooster.
go to rooster. Yeah. Exactly. There's, as far as I know, there's, I didn't read anything about corvids anywhere in the world that do like the long distance migrations like other songbirds do. Like there's no like neotropical migrant corvids. At least there's none in the Northwest. I'll say that for sure. If they're migrating locally, and it's more of maybe using different parts of the habitat at different times of the year, typically.
If you want to see crows in the winter, go to the cattle lots. Yeah. Down to Bozos or
Great.
in those kind of places where the ground's been stomped down and there's things to eat, but they're not in the woods.
Great. So crows avoiding deep snow in winter, looking for, yeah. Yes?
I was gonna say one thing that we've noticed the last couple of years because of the fires, we now have a lot of Clarks. We have a forested land, and we have a lot of Clarks nutcrackers that are eating the pine seeds and the firs, which we used to never have. And now we have them in the winter as well, and we have gray jays, and we've never had gray jays before. So I'm assuming that's the fire.
Where do you live?
Rendezvous.
Upper Rendezvous. And what sort of forest structure do you have?
Pine,
Like ponderosa pine?
yeah.
And you're seeing more gray jays and
The
nutcrackers,
first ever gray jays.
right?
And now, this fall, we had a lot of Clarks, and they were eating all the cones or the seeds from the cones that the squirrels had thrown out of the trees.
Huh.
So they would stand under the trees or the ground, and I'd see 10, 15 at a time, silent, on the ground, and up in the rendezvous, on the ground, eating seeds.
Did everyone catch that story? So there's a kind of novel activity with Clark's nutcrackers in a part of the valley, the Rendezvous, where multiple Clark's nutcrackers on the ground feeding on conifer, or probably ponderosa pine cones that have been dropped by squirrels. And not seeing that. Yeah, so I think as a biologist and as a conservationist and as a naturalist, it's been really interesting to see in my lifetime, in my career, the kind of effects of climate change happening in places, and then also pairing that with kind of the natural kind of big events, ecological events that happen on the landscape, and trying to parse what is kind of kind of more typical, historically typical variation in the patterns of animals and what is novel behavior that we're seeing as ecosystems are shifting into a new regime. And I think that's going to be something that we will see more of in the years to come. And some of that may be just because we're seeing kind of shifts that happen every so often and periods longer than like a year or two. But some of that may be animals learning, trying out new ecological niches to deal with changes in their more typical habitat. And some of those animals will probably be successful, and some of them probably won't.
I should say that we've been there for 23 years, so it's.
Great, so this is in 23 years. Yeah, and so this is an interesting, so in 23 years you haven't seen that, and so this is an ecological quandary question more than like a species quandary, but we get in the habit of thinking about what is typical, what is normal, being what we see for 5 years, for 10 years, but it may be that part of the natural variation in the lives of Clark's nutcrackers and in the forests of the Methow is that they've been doing this often in evolutionary terms. So, maybe every 50 years, or every 100 years, or every 200 years, there's ecological events such that you'll see these kind of dispersals or use of habitat that's generally not their preferred habitat. And so that's just could be kind of something that they've been doing every so often at a cycle just longer than a human lifetime, or than like a part of a human lifetime. And it could be just something that's actually novel. And so this is going to be something that we are going to need to parse out as we sort out what's going on in the landscapes around us. Yeah, Mary.
Well, I've experienced the same thing, just in Edelweiss, so lower down in elevation. But when I first moved, and I've only lived there 8+ years, but there were no Clarks, and I didn't expect there to be Clarks for many, many years. And then the last couple years, it's pretty consistently get Clarks, especially in the winter, but year-round. And I just wondered, if it was like there's less white bark pine for them, so they're coming to conifers. But we will have a whole talk on the Clarks and the white bark pine the last night of the course. But I also wanted to ask a question about, do we think, is there research that shows, are different species communicating with each other? Because you've talked about them communicating interspecies, but then we have all these slides of Clarks with gray jays and Steller's jays and.
Great. So the question is, are these species communicating with each other? And they certainly are. I would hazard to guess. Well, because we communicate with other species, and this is you get into philosophical questions here as well. But there certainly is interactions happening there, and in the same way that a crow will read human body language and figure out, or a raven will read human body language and we'll learn something from that. Like, there's a communication happening there. They're certainly doing that with each other to some degree. And in general, when you have species that share similar ecological niche, as many of our corvids do, so they have slight variations, but they're all feeding on, they may be having shared food resources, so like a carcass. Generally, the larger ones will displace the smaller ones, and there can be some variations in that. If one species tends to be a bit more aggressive potentially than another, we'll see that with squirrels. Eastern gray squirrels are a bit smaller than western grays, but they're more aggressive. So they'll displace them. But in general, the bigger one will displace the smaller one. So there's kind of a hierarchy of who gets access. But then that can be counteracted by numbers as well, as we saw with like you'll see multiple jays or multiple, kind of working around and trying to dislodge a raven and things like that. Does that kind of speak to your?
Yeah, this winter I've noticed a lot, again, around my house, that the Clarks and the Steller's jays are almost like a mixed flock, like the chickadees and the nuthatches are in their own little mixed flock. They just fly around at the same elevation of the tree height, and they seem to squawk back and forth with each other, and I'm sort of wondering, like, can they understand each other? Like, what?
I bet to some degree they
Alexis is saying yes.
Yeah, that would make sense. And there's many examples of that besides mixed flocks of songbirds. There's herds of different ungulates in Africa that will feed together and will access the benefits of that group in terms of detection of danger, and they may feed in slightly different ways that reduces the amount of direct competition going on between them. So yeah, I would assume I would assume that if songbirds that are not nearly as intelligent as corvids are doing that, that certainly corvids are even maybe having a more complex relationship going on there.
Dave, one of our presenters later in the course is going to be talking about that, I think, because I just happened to sit down at base camp at one of their Thursday evenings, and the professor from this group from Missoula is doing research on that, and not just with birds, but with squirrels and other animals. And they actually map how the communication goes through a forest.
I feel like I need to be on the other side of the audience. This is great. So did everyone catch that? Yeah. So please.
That's my advisor. I'm not here. I'll talk about it next week. Come back next week.
Very good. Good. Well, yes, I'll take maybe a couple more questions and we'll wrap things up.
So when you said like corvids are much higher on the intelligence scale than songbirds, I mean, who does that? What is high up on the scale or lower down on the scale, and how do you judge?
Well, here we get into another kind of philosophical, ethical question. So I will refine my statement there and say that on an intellectual intelligence level, there's probably more going on there for corvids than for other songbirds, and that is measured by things like their vocal, like their language, their ability to, and as I mentioned this at the beginning, like their ability to interpret things, to use tools. It's demonstrated that multiple members of the family have used tools. These are all things that are typically associated with a higher cognitive function than animals that are more driven by kind of instinctual behavior or less flexibility in their behavior, and which is more typical of other songbirds, which is they have less plasticity in their behavior and kind of more simple communication structures. And as far as I know, there's no other songbirds that have been demonstrated to use tools. So yeah, that's where I'm going on. Is there anything else in terms of corvid intelligence relative to other songbirds?
Well, it's not just songbirds. What about relative to other birds in general?
Not nearly as smart as chickens.
Okay. But like there are finches that use tools, and they have little sticks and they get insects.
Great.
The branches and all.
Yes.
I just don't know, does anybody do that systematically, or is it just sort of?
Ye-
Captive birds figuring out puzzles and others.
Right.
Yeah.
You can demonstrate with corvids and figure out much more complex puzzles.
So they have done that.
And so I think so there's maybe a question of just what you're measuring and how you're defining these terms.
Well, and how many species they've measured it with.
Right.
That's the question, because I know they've measured it with corvids, and it's great, but I haven't read about trying to do it with other birds and how well it works with them.
All I will say is that if I was trying to hide something from a bird, I would not want that bird to be a corvid. Because I feel much more likely that the corvid would somehow figure out what I tried. So that's maybe my kind of general guideline there. Good. Well, I'll happily take some more questions afterwards. There's some other folks that might be able to answer some questions as well here. I hope that was a good kind of start off for your course on corvids. I'm hoping to come back and sit in on some of the future classes myself as well. Yeah, it's been great. Thanks a lot.